The old couple stood on their porch as strangers measured the home they built with their own hands. The bank had taken everything. But across the street, a man watched in silence, a man who once called that same house home. What he was about to do would change their lives forever. And no one would see it coming. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Morning sunlight spilled over the small Pasadena neighborhood, touching rows of worn-out mailboxes and tired fences. On Willow Street, at the corner lot with the peeling white porch, Martha Lane opened her front door just as the mailman walked up with a single envelope. He hesitated before handing it to her, eyes filled with the kind of pity that needed no words. Martha smiled weakly and said thank you, though her voice trembled. She knew what it was before she even looked. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of old coffee and lemon cleaner. The air was still, heavy. She placed the envelope on the table beside the morning paper, her fingers shaking slightly. She didn't open it right away. For a long minute, she just stared at the name printed in neat black letters, George and Martha Lane. After 50 years of paying bills, raising children, and weathering storms under this roof, it now felt like the house itself was holding its breath. George shuffled in from the living room, a newspaper tucked under his arm. His silver hair was uncombed, his flannel shirt buttoned unevenly. He looked at the envelope, then at her face. "Is it?" he asked quietly. She nodded, sliding it toward him. He took a deep breath, tore it open carefully, and began to read. The letter was short and cold. The bank confirmed the foreclosure and demanded they vacate the property within 30 days. George's lips pressed into a thin line as he read. Martha watched his eyes move slowly over each word, hoping somehow that reading them again might change what they meant. He folded the letter once, twice, then set it down gently on the table. "It's done," he said. "They've taken it." Martha's eyes filled with tears. She gripped the edge of the chair to steady herself. "After all these years," she whispered, "after everything we did to keep this home alive." George looked around the room, his eyes landing on the details. No one else would notice the pencil marks on the doorframe from when their children were small, the chipped blue tiles by the sink that he'd laid himself 40 years ago. "I built this place with my hands," he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of a man trying not to break. Outside, a passing neighbor waved awkwardly, pretending not to notice the eviction notice taped now to their front door. The whole neighborhood had heard whispers of their troubles, but few had come by. Some were too busy. Some didn't want to face the truth that one day it could be them. Martha turned back to her husband. "We'll figure something out," she said, though she didn't believe it. Her voice wavered, the way old wood creaks before it gives. "Maybe the bank will listen if we just explain." George shook his head. "We already tried. They don't listen, not to people like us." The house seemed to absorb their silence. It had always been more than a shelter. It was a scrapbook of their life. The faded wallpaper in the hallway still bore faint patterns from the 1970 seconds. The photographs on the walls told a story of birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet mornings spent in the garden. Everything inside carried the fingerprints of their years together. Martha reached for George's hand, her touch fragile but warm. "It's not fair," she said softly. "They're taking it with paper." He nodded, staring out the kitchen window toward the old oak tree that shaded their backyard. "Paper," he repeated. "That's all it takes to erase a lifetime." The clock on the wall ticked on steadily, uncaring. Time always moved forward, even when people weren't ready. That afternoon, the house grew quieter than usual. The television stayed off. The sound of the clock ticking filled the space between them. George sat at the dining table, staring at the letter again, reading it over as if the words might eventually soften. But they didn't. The ink was sharp, each sentence final. Martha moved slowly through the living room, dusting the framed photographs that lined the mantel. In one photo, George wore his old army uniform, standing tall with a proud grin. In another, The two of them posed in front of this very house, holding hands and smiling as the sold sign leaned crookedly beside them. The memory hit her so hard she had to sit down. She could still remember that day in 1974, the smell of fresh paint, the laughter echoing through the empty rooms, the promise that this would be their forever home. They had built everything here. Two children grew up within these walls, both now living across the country with families of their own. Martha whispered to the photograph, "We kept our promises. We just ran out of time." George finally stood, his chair scraping softly against the wood floor. He walked to the living room window and looked out at the street. It was a peaceful neighborhood, palm trees, trimmed lawns, the faint hum of a gardener's mower down the block. He had always taken pride in keeping the place neat. He mowed every Saturday, painted the fence every spring, even repaired the old porch when his back was still strong. But now, as he watched a young couple walk by with their dog, he felt invisible. They smiled, politely, but didn't stop. It was as if he and Martha were already ghosts in their own home. He turned back to her. "We should start packing," he said quietly, "before it gets harder." Martha looked up, startled. "Packing? Already? George, we still have a month," he sighed. "I know, but maybe it'll hurt less if we do it a little at a time." She stood and walked to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You think packing away 50 years will hurt less if we do it slowly?" she said, her eyes searching his. "It'll just stretch the pain." George didn't answer. His throat tightened. He turned away, walking down the hallway to their bedroom. The walls seemed to whisper with each step, the sound of his boots echoing faintly. On the dresser, beside Martha's jewelry box, sat a small stack of unpaid medical bills from his heart surgery 2 years earlier. He picked them up, stared at the numbers, and let out a long sigh. It wasn't laziness or carelessness that had brought them here. It was simply life medical costs, inflation, fixed income, a few bad breaks that added up. They had done everything right, and somehow it still wasn't enough. He opened the nightstand drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were mementos, a faded medal from his army days, his father's pocket knife, and an old photograph of Martha from when they first met. Her hair was dark then, her smile bright and fearless. He touched the photo gently. Down the hall, Martha called out softly, "George?" He cleared his throat, tucking the photo back into the box. "Coming." As he stepped into the hallway, he caught sight of the family height marks etched into the door frame. Faint lines with names and dates beside them. Michael, age 8. Sarah, 10. The pencil marks had faded, but the memories remained sharp. He ran his fingers over the grooves. "How do you pack something like this?" he whispered to himself. Martha came up beside him, following his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "You don't. You just carry it inside you." The two of them stood there for a long time, bathed in the soft orange light of the setting sun streaming through the hallway window. Outside, the neighborhood began to quiet down for the evening sprinklers clicking on, dogs barking distantly, the faint hum of cars heading home. For everyone else, it was just another day ending. For Martha and George, it was the beginning of the end of a life they'd built together. As night settled over Willow Street, the porch light flickered weakly, casting soft shadows across the lawn. George sat on the steps, holding the eviction letter, his thumb rubbing the crease until the paper frayed. Inside, Martha hummed faintly, folding one last stack of laundry she couldn't bear to box away. From the street, their house looked peaceful. No one could see the heartbreak inside. George glanced at the worn door, whispering, "We kept this place alive longer than anyone thought." His voice broke as he looked up at the stars. "I just wish someone cared enough to remember." The next morning, the quiet Pasadena street stirred to life under the soft hum of early traffic. A moving van idled near the curb, its hazard lights blinking steadily like a heartbeat. Two men in gray uniforms walked up the lane's porch with clipboards, measuring windows and steps. Their voices were low, but efficient, businesslike. Inside, the curtains fluttered slightly as Martha peeked out from behind them, her eyes red from a sleepless night. Across the street, a black motorcycle rolled to a stop. The engine cut off, leaving a heavy stillness. The rider removed his helmet slowly, revealing Keanu Reeves. His hair was slightly tousled from the ride, his face calm, yet shadowed by something deeper. He took off his sunglasses and looked toward the house. For a moment, he just sat there, his gloved hands resting on the handlebars, watching the men move in and out of the yard. Something about that house tugged at him, a strange pull he couldn't shake. It wasn't just another old home on a quiet street. It felt familiar. He leaned back slightly, scanning the roofline, the peeling white porch railing, the oak tree near the fence, and then, like an old photograph surfacing from memory, it hit him. He had been here before. Not recently, not even as an adult, but as a boy. He could almost hear the distant sound of bicycle wheels on gravel, children's laughter echoing in the afternoon heat. The smell of fresh lemonade carried on the breeze. Keanu took a slow breath. The memories were faint, like sunlight filtering through water, but they were there. He remembered a friendly woman who lived on this street, a kind face framed by soft curls, always smiling as she handed out lemonade to neighborhood kids. She had lived in this very house. Could it really be her? He stepped off the bike and walked a little closer, careful to stay unnoticed. The movers kept working, measuring doors and marking notes on their clipboard. From where he stood, Keanu could see the porch swing creak softly in the wind. It was the same one from his childhood. He remembered sitting there once, his scraped knee bandaged by that woman, her gentle voice telling him not to cry. Now, the house looked weary, stripped of its warmth. The grass had turned patchy, the paint was chipped, and the windows were bare. It felt like the soul of the place had been taken away piece by piece. Keanu's heart sank. He had always loved this part of Pasadena, quiet, unpretentious, the kind of neighborhood where everyone once knew everyone. But now, it looked like a forgotten corner of the city. He watched as a man in a suit arrived and began talking to the movers. The man pointed toward the roof and said something about repairs before listing. Keanu's brow furrowed. "Listing?" he murmured. He realized what was happening. The house wasn't being fixed for the owners. It was being prepared to sell. A pang of sadness passed through him. Whoever lived here was losing it, or had already lost it. He leaned against a lamppost, lost in thought. For years he'd worked on films about loss and redemption, but standing here, looking at that quiet house, the emotion felt real in a way no script could capture. Then he saw movement through the living room window, a flash of white hair. A woman stood by the glass, watching the men outside. Her face was tired, her shoulders slightly hunched, but something in her expression felt painfully familiar. Keanu blinked, staring harder. For a brief moment, their eyes almost met through the reflection of sunlight on the window. He froze, his chest tightening. That face, that gentle, time-worn face, looked like the woman who once handed him lemonade all those summers ago. But could it be her? He stepped back, unsure if his memory was betraying him or if fate had really led him back to this street. Keanu lingered by the lamppost, the sunlight glinting faintly off his motorcycle's chrome. He could have ridden away, no one would have noticed, but something rooted him to that spot. The movers kept working, lifting boxes, setting them by the porch, talking about market prices and flippers. The words stung. They spoke of the house as an object, not as the vessel of someone's life. He slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and walked slowly down the sidewalk, pretending to check his phone while taking in the scene. Every step closer stirred fragments of memory running past this same street as a boy, his sneakers slapping the pavement, the summer air thick with the smell of cut grass and barbecue smoke. He remembered kids racing bikes up and down the block, the sound of sprinklers, and the friendly wave of the woman at the corner house always there, always smiling. He glanced toward the porch again. One of the movers brushed past the screen door, leaving it slightly ajar. Through that small gap, Keanu caught a glimpse of the hallway inside, faded yellow wallpaper, a wooden console table lined with photographs. The sight made his chest tighten. He remembered that wallpaper. He remembered it because, years ago, when his family struggled to find stability, this house had felt like a dream. the kind of home that meant safety and kindness. He took a few steps closer, careful not to draw attention. The movers were too busy to notice a quiet man standing by the fence. From where he stood, he could see one photograph clearly framed in silver, its glass cracked slightly at the corner. It showed a young woman with short curls and a floral dress, smiling beside a boy with dark hair holding a bicycle. Keanu's breath caught. That was him. The small boy in the photo, his hand gripping the handlebar, grinning up at her. And the woman she was, Martha. It hit him like a wave of sunlight breaking through clouds. He stepped back, momentarily dizzy. He hadn't thought of her in years, maybe decades, but now every detail flooded back with painful clarity. Her voice, calling him kiddo, the taste of that cold lemonade on hot afternoons, the way she had once bandaged his scraped knee when his mother was late from work. He remembered her laughter most of all, bright, easy, the kind that filled a room without effort. And now, she stood inside that house, old and weary, watching strangers prepare to take away the only thing she had left. Keanu's throat tightened. He wanted to knock on the door, to say something, but he knew it wasn't the right moment. There was something deeply personal about this kind of heartbreak, and he wouldn't intrude on it. Not yet. Instead, he leaned against the old oak tree near the curb and watched quietly as the workers packed up tools and loaded their van. The sun dipped lower, painting the street gold. Across the yard, Martha's shadow moved behind the curtain, slow, tired, and full of memories. For a long moment, Keanu just stood there, lost between past and present. The neighborhood felt frozen in time, yet somehow smaller than he. Remembered. The laughter of children was gone. The familiar warmth had faded. And yet, that single house, worn, fragile, almost broken, still carried the echoes of who they used to be. He looked down at his gloved hands, then back at the porch. "It's her," he whispered to himself. Keanu remained by the oak tree long after the movers left. The street fell silent, broken only by the distant bark of a dog and the slow creak of the porch swing swaying in the evening breeze. Inside, the lights flickered on, casting a warm glow that reminded him of childhood evenings when the neighborhood gathered for lemonade and laughter. But now, the house felt different, a place holding its breath. He watched Martha sit by the window, her frail hands resting on her lap. She looked smaller than he remembered, but her eyes, gentle, kind, unchanging, carried the same warmth that once made a lonely boy feel seen. The years had changed everything around them, yet that simple grace in her presence hadn't faded. A lump formed in his throat. He whispered softly, "You helped me when I had nothing, and you never even knew it." The memory of her kindness all those years ago had lived quietly inside him, shaping the man he became. As he put on his helmet, his reflection in the visor caught the glimmer of the for sale sign on her lawn. It stood like a gravestone for a lifetime of memories. He tightened the strap, eyes hardening with quiet resolve. He knew what he had to do. Tomorrow, he would find out who took the house from her, and somehow, some way, he would bring it back. The next morning, Keanu parked outside a modest brick building on Colorado Boulevard. The gold letters on the window read, Pasadena First National Bank. He sat for a moment on his motorcycle, watching the steady flow of people coming and going, business owners, retirees, young families, all moving through life as if nothing around them could fall apart. But for George and Martha Lane, everything already had. He removed his sunglasses, ran a hand through his hair, and stepped inside. The smell of coffee and copier toner filled the air. Behind polished desks, tellers smiled at customers, their voices pleasant but rehearsed. To them, foreclosure was just another line item, another box to check. Keanu approached the reception counter. "Good morning," the young woman said brightly. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to speak with your property manager," he replied calmly. "Someone named Cunningham." The receptionist checked her screen, hesitated, and then nodded. "Mr. Cunningham is available. Do you have an appointment?" Keanu gave a small smile. "Not exactly, but I think he'll want to take this one." Within minutes, a tall man in a tailored gray suit approached. His hair was perfectly combed, his handshake firm but perfunctory. "Mr. Reeves, it's an honor," he said, smiling the kind of smile used in negotiations. "What brings you here? I didn't know you had accounts with us." Keanu returned the handshake. "I don't. I'm here about a property one on Willow Street." Cunningham's smile flickered for just a moment before returning. "Ah, that one. Yes, the Lanes. Difficult case. We've been handling that account for quite some time." He gestured toward his office. "Please, have a seat." Inside, the office was spotless. Diplomas lined the wall, and a small plaque on his desk read, "Efficiency is integrity." Keanu sat quietly across from him, his gaze steady but unreadable. "I wanted to understand what happened," Keanu began, "to the couple who lived there." Cunningham leaned back, crossing his legs. "They fell behind on payments. Happens all the time, unfortunately. Medical bills, I believe. The husband George, I think, had heart surgery a while back. After that, things started slipping. We offered refinancing, but they were already too far behind." Keanu nodded slowly. "Too far behind," he repeated. "By how much?" The banker glanced at his screen. "Roughly $78,000, plus interest and fees. We were patient, but policy is policy." Keanu's jaw tightened slightly. "Policy." Cunningham didn't notice the tension in his voice. He continued, "We'll be putting the property up for auction next month. Likely a developer will pick it up. That neighborhood's old, but the lots are solid. Probably tear it down, build something modern. Happens every week around here." Keanu's eyes darkened. "And the Lanes? They'll be fine, I'm sure," Cunningham said with a dismissive shrug. "They can rent somewhere nearby. The city has housing assistance programs. We even sent them pamphlets." Keanu looked at him for a long moment, saying nothing. The air between them grew heavier, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the silence. Finally, he spoke, his tone calm but firm. "You said developers are interested?" "Yes, that's right," Cunningham replied. "Why do you ask?" Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Because I want to make a private bid." The banker blinked. "On that property?" "Yes," Keanu said. "Through a charitable foundation, anonymously." Cunningham hesitated, measuring him. "That's unusual. Are you sure you want that one? It's an old place. Needs work. Not exactly a sound investment." "It's not about investment," Keanu said quietly. "It's about preservation." The words hung in the air, soft but unshakable. Cunningham tapped his pen on the desk, clearly intrigued. "Preservation," he repeated, as if testing the word for meaning. "That's not something we usually hear in this office." Keanu didn't flinch. "Maybe it should be," he said softly. His tone wasn't confrontational, just matter of fact, the kind of calm that carried weight. The banker cleared his throat. "Well, if you're serious, we can explore an early bid. But I'll need to disclose certain details. Usually, the bank lists it publicly." Keanu nodded. "I understand, but I'd like to proceed through a foundation I represent. It's a charitable organization focused on restoring homes for community members who've lost them due to hardship." Cunningham raised an eyebrow. "Which foundation?" Keanu smiled faintly. "It's still in development," he said. "The paperwork is being finalized under the name The Light Foundation. You'll have all the proper documentation within 48 hours." The banker studied him for a moment, unsure if he was serious or simply entertaining an idea. "You're really planning to purchase this house anonymously, without taking credit?" "That's right," Keanu replied. Cunningham leaned back, trying to gauge the motive behind the calm composure. "Most buyers want visibility. There's usually some PR angle. You could easily make this a public campaign, generate awareness about foreclosures, maybe partner with the city." Keanu shook his head. "That's not what this is about. I don't want cameras. I just want to make it right." The simplicity of that statement caught the banker off guard. He sat in silence, tapping his pen again, searching for something professional to say. "You understand, Mr. Reeves. The bank isn't responsible for what happens after we sell. You can't change the past. These things are procedural." Keanu's gaze softened. Procedural doesn't mean humane, he said. You deal with numbers. I deal with people. Sometimes those two things need to meet halfway. Cunningham exhaled slowly. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, not angrily, not critically, but with quiet conviction that made his own words sound hollow. He cleared his throat again. All right, he said finally. I'll make the arrangements. If your foundation wishes to make an offer, I can delay the auction notice by a week. But the price must meet the full foreclosure amount, principal, fees, everything. Keanu nodded. Understood. I'll send over the documentation for your legal team, Cunningham continued. And for transparency, I'll need your signature on the initial expression of interest. Just formality. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out a pen of his own. Not flashy, just a simple black one. Let's do it. Cunningham slid the paper across the desk, watching as Keanu signed it. He noticed the steadiness in the actor's hand, not a trace of hesitation. When it was done, he placed the pen down gently and looked up. Tell me, Keanu said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. Do you ever think about the people behind these papers? Cunningham looked confused. The people? Yes, Keanu said. When you process a foreclosure, when you stamp a letter or list a home, do you ever wonder what's happening on the other side of that door? The question lingered. For the first time, the banker didn't have an answer ready. Keanu stood, offering his hand again. Thank you for your time. I'll be in touch soon. Cunningham shook it, still uncertain what had just happened. He watched Keanu leave the office, the faint scent of leather and coffee following him. Through the glass door, he saw the actor step into the bright Pasadena sunlight, slip on his sunglasses, and walk toward his motorcycle. There was something steady in the way he moved, a quiet purpose that didn't need explanation. As the door closed behind him, Cunningham whispered to himself, preservation. Outside, the afternoon light washed the street in gold. Keanu stood by his motorcycle, the soft hum of the city around him fading into a quiet he carried inside. The conversation replayed in his mind the way Cunningham had spoken about policy as if compassion were an afterthought. It wasn't anger he felt. It was something deeper, heavier, a sadness for how easily people's stories were reduced to statistics. He looked across the street toward the direction of Willow Avenue, where the Lanes' home sat, waiting in silence. In that moment, the distance between wealth and struggle felt impossibly wide, but he also knew bridges could be built in silence, not with fame, not with words, but with action. He sat on his bike, resting his hands on the handlebars, and took a long breath. The memories of his own childhood drifted back again, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. He remembered the sting of uncertainty, the longing for stability, the ache of watching adults hide worry behind forced smiles. Martha and George didn't deserve to end their lives this way, not after decades of honest work and kindness. If a small act could undo even a fraction of that injustice, he would do it. He started the engine, the deep rumble cutting through the afternoon stillness. As he pulled into traffic, he glanced once more toward Willow Street. The house stood unseen in the distance, but he could feel its pull, a silent promise made to the past. He whispered under his breath, "You gave me kindness when I needed it most. Now it's my turn." The road ahead shimmered with sunlight, leading him toward a plan that would soon change everything. That night, Keanu sat alone in his study, the soft hum of the city outside, replaced by the quiet tapping of his keyboard. The glow from his laptop cast a faint light over a desk, cluttered with notes, receipts, and a half-finished cup of coffee. On the screen was a search bar. He had typed, "George and Martha Lane Pasadena foreclosure." Dozens of results appeared, legal filings, property notices, and one short news article titled, "Elderly Couple Loses Home After Medical Debt Crisis." He clicked it. The photo at the top of the page showed George and Martha standing outside their house, holding hands, their eyes downcast. The caption read, "We just ran out of ways to keep up," says George Lane, a Korean War veteran who fell behind on payments after heart surgery. Keanu leaned back, exhaling slowly. He scrolled down, reading every line carefully. The article mentioned that Martha had volunteered at Huntington Memorial Hospital for over 40 years. She was known as Miss Marigold, for her habit of bringing flowers to patients' rooms every spring. George, it said, had worked as a local handyman, often fixing fences and porches for neighbors who couldn't afford to pay. The writer ended with a single quote from George. "I always believed if you do good, good comes back. Maybe it's just taking the long way home." Keanu stared at that line. Maybe it's just taking the long way home. It echoed inside him, quiet but profound. He opened a new tab and began searching deeper community boards, social media posts, even archived newsletters from the local church. Everywhere he looked, the same story unfolded. Two people who had spent their lives giving. A post from a neighbor read, "When my father broke his leg, George built a ramp for free. Wouldn't take a dime." Another said, "Martha brought cookies every Christmas to the firehouse. Said it was her way of thanking them for being keepers of the light." Keanu scrolled through the comments for hours. None of these people knew he was reading. None of them knew that the man behind the screen had once been the little boy down the street, the one who used to sit on their porch swing sipping lemonade. He whispered to himself, "Good. People like this shouldn't be forgotten." The words lingered in the air. He closed his laptop slowly and looked out the window toward the dark skyline. For years, he'd given millions to causes across the world, children's hospitals, cancer research, shelters. But this felt different. This wasn't charity. It was something personal, intimate. He picked up his phone and called a familiar number. "Hey," he said quietly when his assistant answered, "I need to set up a new foundation. Small, local, and private." There was a pause on the other end. "A foundation, sir." "What for?" "For people who've given more than they ever received," Keanu said. "Call it the Light Foundation." He glanced again at the screen, showing George's quote, "Make it official tomorrow. I'll fund it anonymously through the trust." His assistant hesitated. "What's the mission statement?" Keanu smiled faintly. "To preserve homes that still carry kindness in their walls." He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, the faint reflection of the foreclosure photo still visible on his laptop screen. The house looked small and tired, but to him, it glowed like a light, waiting to be rekindled. The following morning, sunlight spilled across the Los Angeles skyline as Keanu sat in the back of his quiet black SUV, scrolling through old articles and handwritten notes. The city moved past his window, billboards, cafes, construction sites, but his mind was far from all of it. Every word he'd read about George and Martha the night before still echoed in his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that people like them represented something America was losing. Quiet decency, simple goodness, a belief that kindness was its own reward. He remembered his own mother once saying, "Never forget the hands that helped you, even if they never ask for thanks." He hadn't. When he arrived at his small private office in Burbank, his assistant, Lila, was already waiting. She greeted him with her usual professionalism, though curiosity flickered in her eyes. "You wanted to move forward with that new foundation," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "I've spoken with the legal team. It can be registered under an anonymous charitable trust. We just need a few signatures." Keanu nodded. "And the name?" Lila smiled faintly. "The Light Foundation, as requested." He opened the folder. The document inside read, "Mission to preserve homes and restore dignity to those who've quietly given to their communities." Below that was a short motto he'd written himself at dawn. "Goodness should have somewhere to live." He signed the papers carefully, his pen gliding smoothly across the page. "Set up an acquisition channel," he said. "It'll need to handle property bids quietly through intermediaries." "Understood," Lila replied. "What's the first property?" He looked out the window toward the far hills. "A small home on Willow Street, Pasadena. I'll send you the details. It's not just a house, it's part of someone's story, and maybe mine." Lila didn't press for details. She had worked with him long enough to recognize when something mattered deeply. After she left, Keanu opened his laptop again. He pulled up an old street map of Pasadena and zoomed in on the neighborhood where he'd once ridden his bike. The layout hadn't changed much. Same curved roads, same tall oak trees, same small lawns that caught the afternoon sun. He could almost hear the echoes of his own childhood laughter. He clicked through satellite images of the Lanes' property. The porch sagged slightly. The paint was faded, but the garden still showed care, a few patches of marigolds by the fence, stubborn and bright. He smiled softly. Miss Marigold. That was what the article had called her. The name fit perfectly. He jotted down notes. Contact contractor discreetly. Preserve structure. Maintain layout. No demolitions. He wanted the house restored, not replaced. It had a soul, and he wouldn't let it vanish under modern glass and steel. He paused and whispered, "This isn't about charity. It's about memory." The room was silent, except for the ticking of a small clock. Outside, the city hummed on, unaware that within this quiet space, one man was preparing to rewrite the ending of a forgotten story. He stared at the last note he'd written and drew a small underline beneath it. Then, almost without realizing it, he said aloud, "Let's start with theirs." 2 nights later, Keanu sat by the large window of his home, the city lights twinkling like distant memories below. On the table before him lay a neat stack of papers, legal filings, trust agreements, and financial authorizations. The Light Foundation was now real, registered, and active. Its first mission, to quietly reclaim one house on Willow Street. He reviewed every page with care. The foundation's funds were routed through a private trust, its board filled with silent partners, people who understood discretion. Each clause in the document carried purpose. No names, no press, no publicity. The Light Foundation would exist for people like George and Martha, those who gave without asking for anything back. When he finished, he called Lila again. "Everything's ready," he said. "Reach out to the bank's property division tomorrow. Make an offer through the foundation." "Understood," she replied softly. "Do you want to be notified when the sale clears?" Keanu hesitated. "No," he said finally. "I'll know when it happens." After the call, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze wandering across the city skyline. Somewhere out there, the Lanes were packing boxes, wondering where they'd go next. He imagined Martha folding old photographs into tissue paper, George wrapping his army medals in a towel. Every scene felt heavy, yet he knew soon they'd have those memories back where they belonged. He reached for his notebook and wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. "Restoring what kindness built." The words settled over him like a quiet vow. He thought of Martha's gentle voice, George's steady hands, and the way that house had once glowed with laughter and warmth. As the clock ticked past midnight, he whispered into the stillness, "You gave light to others your whole lives. Now it's time someone gave it back." Then he closed the folder, exhaled deeply, and looked toward the dark horizon. Somewhere in that night sky, the faintest flicker of light blinked steady, patient, unwavering. And for the first time in years, Keanu felt that same light awaken inside him again. The morning air on Willow Street was heavy with quiet. The sky was pale gray, as if even the weather understood the weight of what was happening. A moving truck idled by the curb, its engine rumbling softly as 2 young movers lifted boxes marked kitchen, bedroom, and memories. The letters were written in Martha's delicate script, each one trembling slightly, the ink smudged where her hand had hesitated. Inside, the house was nearly empty. The echo of footsteps replaced the warmth of laughter that once filled those rooms. Martha stood in the living room, holding a small porcelain figurine, a ballerina with one cracked arm. It had belonged to her mother. She turned it slowly in her hand before wrapping it in tissue paper and tucking it into a box lined with towels. George moved slower than usual, his back bent, his breath short. He carried a wooden frame containing their wedding photo, 1958, both of them young and hopeful. The image inside was slightly faded, but their smiles were bright. He looked at it for a moment, then set it down carefully. "You'd think after 70 years I'd be good at goodbyes," he said quietly. Martha tried to smile, but it broke halfway. "It's not goodbye," she whispered. "It's just moving on." He nodded, though his eyes betrayed him. Every step he took toward the door felt heavier than the last. Outside, the neighbors watched from across the street. Some waved, some pretended to be busy trimming hedges or washing cars. A few looked down, guilty for their silence. Only one neighbor, Mrs. Diaz from 2 houses down, came over with a small bag of sandwiches. "For the road," she said softly, handing them to Martha. Her voice cracked as she added, "We'll miss you." Martha took her hand and squeezed it. "Thank you. I'll miss the marigolds." Mrs. Diaz smiled faintly. "They'll still bloom for you next spring." The movers closed the truck's back door with a dull thud. The sound echoed down the playing street like the closing of a chapter. Across the road, a man in a black jacket and baseball cap leaned casually against a streetlight. His face was half hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his eyes were fixed on the lane's porch. Keanu had arrived quietly, just as the truck pulled up. He watched the couple step outside together, their hands clasped. They paused at the bottom of the steps, turning for one last look at their home. George's lips moved slightly, as if he were whispering something to the house itself, a goodbye, a prayer, or maybe a promise. Martha touched the doorframe, running her fingers over the faded paint. "Feels like we're leaving our story behind," she said softly. From his place across the street, Keanu's heart clenched. He wanted to walk over, to tell them they weren't losing their story at all, but he stayed still. This was their moment, and he wouldn't intrude. He simply watched, his eyes glistening beneath the shadow of his cap. The truck began to roll forward slowly. Martha leaned out the window, waving back at the empty house. George raised his hand too, though he couldn't bring himself to look. Keanu took a deep breath, watching until the truck turned the corner and disappeared. Only the quiet remained, the kind that feels sacred, like the silence after a prayer. He crossed the street slowly, his footsteps soft against the pavement. Standing at the base of the porch, he looked up at the house that had once held his childhood laughter. The front door was closed now, the windows still, the curtains drawn. He stepped closer and rested his hand on the old wooden railing. It felt smooth and familiar beneath his palm, worn by time, but still strong. He whispered, "No, you're not leaving your story behind." The house was silent now, its rooms stripped bare of the rhythm that once filled them. Dust floated lazily through thin shafts of morning light, settling on the places where picture frames used to hang. The Pratable wallpaper, faded by years of sunlight, revealed small square shadows, ghosts of memories that refused to leave. Keanu stepped inside through the unlocked front door. The air carried the scent of old wood and time. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to greet him, like the whisper of an old friend. He took off his hat and stood still for a moment, letting the silence sink in. He walked through the hallway first, tracing the faint pencil lines on the doorframe, the same ones George had once touched before leaving. There were names beside each line: Michael, age 8, Sarah, age 10. A life measured not by wealth, but by inches of growth. He smiled softly, running his fingers over the marks. In the kitchen, he opened a cabinet door and found a single cup left behind white porcelain with a tiny chip near the rim. He lifted it carefully, remembering Martha handing him a similar one filled with lemonade decades ago. It had been the first kindness he'd received after moving to that neighborhood, a boy lost in a new world. He set the cup down gently, whispering, "You never stopped being kind." Moving through the living room, he noticed the outline on the wall where the family portrait had hung. Beneath it, a thin crack ran down the plaster. He crouched beside it, pressing his hand against the surface. It was solid, old, and steady, like the people who'd lived here. Outside, the street had quieted completely. The moving truck was gone, and the neighbors had retreated behind their doors. The only sound left was the soft rustle of marigold petals brushing against the porch steps. Keanu stepped outside again and sat on the top step, looking out over the yard. He imagined George pushing a lawnmower, Martha calling him in for lunch, the scent of pie drifting from the kitchen window. It wasn't hard to picture. The spirit of the place was still alive, just waiting for someone to care enough to listen. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, deep in thought. "No one should have to lose a home like this," he murmured. The words weren't loud, but they carried conviction. He took one last look at the house, the cracked porch, the peeling paint, the tired shutters, and saw beyond it what it could be again. Not a property, not an address, but a home reborn. He rose slowly, touching the railing once more before leaving. The wood was rough beneath his fingertips, but solid, still standing after all the years. He nodded slightly, as if making a silent promise. "This place isn't finished," he said quietly. As evening settled over Pasadena, a warm orange glow spread across the quiet street. The old house stood still beneath the fading sky, its windows reflecting the last light of day. Keanu remained on the porch steps, watching the colors shift across the wood like memories finding their way home. He took out his phone and opened a new contact message to Lila. "Find a restoration team," he typed. "Discreet, local, respectful. No demolition, full preservation. This isn't a rebuild, it's a renewal." He paused, then added one more line. "Begin immediately after transfer of ownership." He pressed send and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The plan was in motion. Rising to his feet, he walked slowly around the house, taking in every detail. The cracked shutters, the chipped steps, the rusted hinges on the front gate, each flaw told a story. He imagined how George's hands once repaired these same hinges, how Martha's laughter must have floated through the open windows on warm afternoons. The air still carried a faint sweetness, like lemon and old wood, the scent of a life well lived. Keanu stopped beneath the oak tree that shaded the backyard. The marigolds near the fence glowed faintly in the dimming light, stubbornly alive despite the neglect. He bent down, brushing his fingers lightly over the petals. "You held on," he whispered, almost to the flowers themselves. He looked back at the house, its roofline glowing faintly under the setting sun. In that moment, it no longer looked like a symbol of loss. It looked like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Keanu took a long breath, then said softly, "You gave kindness to everyone who passed through this street. Now, kindness will come back to you." He stepped off the porch, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. As he walked away, the porch light flickered once in the dusk, catching his shadow across the grass, as if the house itself had heard him and was waiting, quietly, for its heart to return. A week later, the bank quietly accepted the bid. There was no announcement, no press release, no whisper of who the mysterious buyer was. The documents listed only one name, the Light Foundation. For the bank, it was a convenient transaction. For Keanu, it was a promise fulfilled. The process had moved quickly. The property had sat vacant for weeks, its overgrown lawn and peeling paint marking it as another forgotten relic on Willow Street. But now, under the foundation's name, everything would change. Keanu received the call from Lila one morning while sitting on the back patio of his home. "It's official," she said. "The property is yours technically, the foundation's." The bank accepted the offer without countering. He smiled faintly. "Good. That means we can start the restoration right away. I've already reached out to the local contractors you requested," Lila added. "They're old-school craftsmen. No corporate developers, no demolition teams. Just people who still know how to fix something with care." "Perfect," Keanu said quietly. "Tell them to keep everything as it is. Every window, every tile, every mark on the wall. This house has history. I want that history to stay." He ended the call and sat still for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The house that once gave him lemonade and kindness now belonged to him, though no one would ever know. By evening, a small crew had gathered outside the property. The old "for sale" sign was taken down and replaced with a simple notice, "Private restoration in progress." A light breeze carried the scent of dust and fresh paint as the workers began removing debris from the porch. Keanu arrived quietly after sunset, wearing a cap and jacket, keeping to the shadows. He watched them from the sidewalk, admiring their care. They moved slowly, respectfully, speaking in low voices. Every board lifted, every nail pulled, was treated like a memory being uncovered rather than discarded. When the crew finally left for the night, Keanu walked up to the porch and unlocked the door with the new key. The hinges creaked softly as he stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of dust and rain, but something about it already felt alive again. He moved from room to room, studying the details: the old chandelier missing a crystal, the window latch that stuck, the faint outline of where a picture once hung. He didn't see imperfection. He saw a story worth saving. As he entered the hallway, his eyes caught the faint pencil lines again. Michael, age 8, Sarah, age 10. Time had faded them, but not erased them. He smiled. Then he saw something even more unexpected. Near the living room doorway, half hidden beneath layers of old paint, was another set of marks, smaller, lower to the ground. He crouched down and brushed the wall with his fingertips. The faint letters spelled out KR9. He froze. That was him. He remembered it now, Martha handing him a pencil and telling him to mark his height like family. He had forgotten that day until this very moment. A quiet laugh escaped him, mixed with something close to a sigh. "You really did make everyone feel at home," he whispered. He stood for a long time in that empty living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of memory. Within days, the transformation began. Each morning, a small crew of local craftsmen arrived: painters, carpenters, and one elderly mason named Frank, who had lived in Pasadena his whole life. There were no loud machines, no demolition trucks, no corporate logos. Only the steady rhythm of hammers, brushes, and careful hands at work. Keanu watched from afar most days, parked under the shade of the oak tree across the street. He didn't need to supervise. He simply wanted to witness. The sight of workers restoring the porch, sanding the window frames, and reattaching the weathered shutters felt like watching the past breathe again. At night, when the crew was gone, he would return. With a flashlight in one hand, he'd move through the dim rooms slowly, quietly. He checked every detail: the walls being patched with care, the floorboards carefully refinished instead of replaced. He'd asked them to preserve as much of the original structure as possible, and they had honored that request. One evening, he stopped in the hallway again, his light catching on the pencil marks where his initials had been carved decades ago. He smiled faintly and touched the wall. "Still here," he murmured. The paint was new, but beneath it, the house still held the warmth it always had. He moved into the living room, where the scent of varnish lingered from the newly polished floors. The fireplace had been scrubbed clean, its mantel restored to its natural oak color. The workmen had found old coins and marbles inside one of the floor vents and placed them neatly on the windowsill, unsure if they were worth anything. Keanu chuckled softly when he saw them, small pieces of forgotten childhood, waiting to be rediscovered. He bent down, picking up one of the marbles. It was cloudy blue, worn smooth from play. "Probably mine," he whispered. The moonlight spilled through the windows, lighting the dust particles that floated through the air like slow-moving stars. He stood there, lost in the simple peace of the moment. The house was beginning to feel whole again. Outside, a soft wind brushed against the porch, carrying the scent of marigolds. He stepped outside and looked around. The yard was tidier now, the paint on the railing gleaming under the moonlight. The marigolds by the fence had survived every storm, just like the people who once lived here. He sat on the porch step, gazing at the house that had once sheltered kindness, and felt something inside him settle. In Hollywood, he was always surrounded by lights, applause, and fleeting praise. But here, in the silence of this small Pasadena home, he found what fame could never give him peace. The next morning, he left a note for the crew on the kitchen counter. It read, "Keep the heart of the home alive. Don't replace what time built, restore it." He signed it simply, "The Foundation." By the end of the week, new life had crept back into every corner of the house. The porch shone in fresh white paint. The windows reflected sunlight again. The creaking floorboards had been repaired, not silenced, as if the house was speaking softly once more. And though no one in the neighborhood knew who the mysterious benefactor was, everyone began to whisper that something beautiful was happening on Willow Street. By the end of the month, the house on Willow Street no longer looked abandoned. Its porch gleamed under the afternoon sun, The shutters stood straight again, and the marigolds by the fence had burst into new blooms. Neighbors stopped to admire the transformation, curious about who had saved it. The only clue was the small bronze plaque beside the door that read, "Restored by the Light Foundation." No one had ever heard of it, but everyone felt its presence. That night, long after the workers had gone, Keanu returned once more. He parked his motorcycle a few houses away and walked the quiet block, his footsteps slow and thoughtful. The air smelled faintly of paint and jasmine. When he reached the porch, he paused, staring up at the caisson, glowing windows. The home looked alive again. Not perfect, not new, but whole. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked gently under his boots, familiar and comforting. The rooms were empty, waiting for laughter to return. He ran his hand along the newly finished banister, then stopped in the living room. The faint light from the street poured across the wall, the same wall where his childhood height mark had been preserved beneath a thin layer of protective varnish. He smiled softly. "Still standing," he whispered. He walked toward the fireplace and sat for a moment on the edge of the hearth. The warmth of memory filled the space. The echo of George's steady voice, Martha's laughter, the soft clink of lemonade glasses in the summer. For a brief second, he imagined them there again, sitting beside him, hands clasped, proud and at peace. The thought brought a quiet ache to his chest, but also a calm he hadn't felt in years. Keanu stood and looked around one last time. "You're ready," he said quietly. "You're home again." As he stepped out onto the porch, the breeze stirred gently through the marigolds, brushing his sleeve, as if in thanks. The porch light flickered softly, steadying into a warm glow. He smiled, turned toward the dark street, and walked away, leaving the light burning behind him. The new apartment was small and gray, tucked behind a grocery store on the edge of town. Its single window looked out over an alleyway lined with trash bins and humming air conditioners. George did his best to make it feel like home, a rug here, a lamp there, a few pictures on the shelf. But nothing could hide the emptiness that followed them from Willow Street. Martha sat most days by the window, staring at the flickering neon sign from the diner across the alley. Her hands, once busy baking pies and folding laundry, now rested motionless in her lap. She barely spoke. Her eyes had the faraway look of someone still standing in the doorway of a lost home. George tried everything to lift her spirits. He cooked her favorite soup, read aloud from her worn romance novels, even brought home marigolds from a sidewalk stand. "Look, honey," he said one morning, placing the flowers in an old jar. "They still bloom, even here." She managed a weak smile, but didn't respond. The marigolds wilted within a day. At night, George lay awake, listening to the sounds of the city outside: sirens, engines, laughter from a nearby bar. None of it felt like the quiet rhythm they'd known on Willow Street. He thought about the oak tree, the creak of their porch swing, the way Martha used to hum when she cooked. Each memory pressed on him, like a weight he couldn't shake off. Bills piled up on the counter: rent, utilities, medication. The pension barely covered what they needed. George had always prided himself on handling things himself, but now he found himself counting every dollar at the end of the week. Pride had once been his armor. Now it was just heavy. One afternoon, he returned from the pharmacy to find Martha sitting on the floor beside a half-open box of old photos. She was holding one picture closed, the two of them on their wedding day, standing in front of the house that no longer belonged to them. Her hands trembled as she traced the edges of the photo. "George," she whispered, her voice thin. "I still see it when I close my eyes." The kitchen, the garden, the sound of the floor creaking when you walked in from work. He knelt beside her, his own voice breaking. "We'll find another place, sweetheart. Maybe near the park, somewhere quiet." She shook her head. "It's not the walls I miss. It's who we were inside them." That night, she didn't eat dinner. Her appetite faded along with her strength. Each morning, she moved slower, as though the weight of loss had seeped into her bones. George tried to hide his worry, but fear began to live in his chest like a second heartbeat. One morning, she didn't wake up easily. Her skin was pale, her breath shallow. George called for an ambulance, his hands trembling so badly he could barely dial. The paramedics arrived quickly, their voices brisk and professional, but the sight of Martha being lifted onto a stretcher made something inside him crack. As they wheeled her out, he whispered, "Hang on, honey, I'm right behind you." The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, a mix that never left the air no matter how many windows stood open. George sat in the waiting area, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. Every few minutes, a doctor or nurse passed by, their shoes whispering across the tiles. None of them stopped. None of them called his name. When the double doors finally swung open, a nurse approached him with a clipboard. She was middle-aged, her expression kind but tired, her badge reading Nurse Claire Ramirez. She sat beside him instead of standing, which somehow made him feel seen. "Mr. Lane," she said gently, "your wife's resting now. She's stable, but she's weak. Her blood pressure's low, and she's showing signs of exhaustion. Has she been eating regularly?" George shook his head, eyes downcast. "Not much. Since we lost the house, she hasn't had the strength. I thought she'd bounce back once we got settled, but she..." His voice trailed off. Claire nodded, jotting a note. "Grief can do that. Sometimes the body feels what the heart can't say." George swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. She's always been the strong one, always taking care of everyone else. "I don't know how to help her." The nurse hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, people who give all their lives don't know how to receive help. But that's what we're here for." He nodded faintly, though his eyes never lifted from the floor. Claire stood, offering him a small smile. "She'll sleep for a while. You should get some rest too." But George didn't move. He sat there long after she'd gone, his mind wandering back to the life they'd built, the laughter, the birthdays, the quiet dinners on that same porch they no longer owned. Every memory felt like a knife twisted gently, slowly. Later that night, he was allowed to see her. The room was dim, the soft beep of monitors breaking the silence. Martha looked small under the white sheets, her hands resting lightly on her stomach. Her face was peaceful, but her color was pale. He sat beside her, holding her hand. "You remember that old swing I built?" he whispered. "The one that creaked every time you sat on it? You always said you liked the sound because it meant I was near." A tear slipped down his cheek. "I wish I could fix things, like I fixed that swing." She stirred slightly but didn't wake. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. George drifted between prayer and exhaustion, until morning light slipped through the blinds. Claire returned, carrying a small stack of brochures. "Mr. Lane," she said softly, "I know this might not be the right time, but there's something I'd like you to look at." She handed him a thin pamphlet with a clean white cover. Across the front was a simple logo, a single golden flame above the words, "The Light Foundation." George frowned. "What's this?" "It's a new organization that's been helping displaced veterans and their families," Claire explained. "They work quietly, but I've heard they've done some good. They help people find housing, especially those who've lost homes recently." George looked at it without real interest, his thoughts still on Martha. "We don't need charity," he said, more out of pride than conviction. "It's not charity," Claire said kindly. "It's restoration. Sometimes people just need a little light to find their way again." She left the brochure on the nightstand beside Martha's bed and gave his shoulder a gentle pat before leaving. George stared at the logo for a long moment, that tiny golden flame flickering on the paper. He didn't know it yet, but that same flame had already begun to burn quietly for him. That night, George stayed by Martha's side as the monitors blinked rhythmically beside her. The room was dim, except for the pale light from the hallway, casting soft shadows across the walls. On the nightstand, the brochure lay half-folded, the small golden flame catching the faint glow. George picked it up absent-mindedly, running his thumb over the logo. He opened it, reading the words inside slowly. "The Light Foundation, dedicated to restoring dignity and hope for those who've given much and lost more." Because good people deserve good endings. His eyes lingered there. For the first time in weeks, something stirred within him, not quite belief, but not despair either. The words felt genuine, written by someone who understood loss. He turned the page, and saw a short note about their mission to help veterans. Founded by anonymous donors, it said, to honor those whose quiet service still lights the world. He exhaled deeply and folded the paper shut, setting it back down beside the bed. He looked at Martha, her chest rising and falling slowly. Maybe there's still a little light left for us, huh? He whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Outside, the night pressed against the window, the hum of the hospital muffled and distant. He sat back in his chair, eyes heavy, his hand still resting on hers. For the first time since they'd left their home, sleep came gently. When morning broke, the nurse found him dozing, the brochure still in his other hand. She smiled faintly and adjusted the blanket around Martha's shoulders. As she did, the paper slipped to the floor, the flame logo facing upward, glowing softly in the early sunlight. Neither George nor Martha knew it yet, but that small flicker, that symbol of light, was already moving toward them, carried by unseen hands and quiet intentions. And far across town, in a modest office filled with sketches and blueprints, Keanu Reeves signed a single approval form for the Light Foundation's first housing restoration program. One word was written in the margin beside it: Willow. A week passed after Martha's release from the hospital. She was home again, but home was still that small apartment with the flickering light and the humming air conditioner in the alley. George spent most days at her side, making tea, reading quietly from her favorite old books, and pretending not to notice how thin she'd become. He'd learned to hide his worry, but at night, when she slept, he'd sit awake listening to her shallow breathing, counting the spaces between each rise and fall of her chest. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled weakly through the blinds, the phone rang. George hesitated before answering, expecting another bill collector. "Hello?" A calm female voice greeted him. "Good afternoon. Is this Mr. George Lane?" "My name is Angela. I'm calling from the Light Foundation. We're a nonprofit organization that assists veterans and their families who've experienced hardship. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." George frowned slightly, glancing at the small brochure on the counter, the same one Nurse Claire had given him at the hospital. "I've heard of you," he said. "But if you're offering financial help, I'm afraid we can't take it. We're not charity cases." Angela's tone stayed gentle. "This isn't about charity, Mr. Lane. It's about gratitude. We recently completed the renovation of a home that's being donated to a deserving veteran and spouse, a couple who've served their community quietly, without recognition. Your names came to us through a local referral list." He blinked, unsure what to say. "I don't understand," he replied slowly. "You're giving away a house?" "Yes," she said warmly. "We'd like to invite you and your wife to visit it tomorrow evening. There's no paperwork, no obligation, no fees. We just want you to see it." Sometimes, the right home finds its people again. George's heart beat faster. "Ma'am, I appreciate the kindness, but we don't have the means," for Angela interrupted softly. "Mr. Lane, it's not about money." Her words hung in the air like a bell ringing through silence. He turned to look at Martha, resting on the couch beneath a quilt. She was awake now, watching him curiously. He covered the phone with his hand. "It's someone from that foundation the nurse told us about," he said quietly. "They want us to look at a house. Says it's for us." Martha's lips trembled into the faintest smile. "A house?" she whispered. "George, that sounds too good to be true." He nodded. "That's what I thought." But Angela's voice came through the receiver again, calm and certain. "We'll send transportation for you both tomorrow at 5. You don't need to bring anything, just yourselves." George hesitated one last moment, then sighed. "All right, we'll come." When the call ended, he sat still, staring at the silent phone. Martha reached out and took his hand. "You think this is real?" He looked at her fragile face, the light of hope flickering faintly in her eyes. "I don't know," he said softly. "But maybe we should find out." That night, they packed nothing, just dressed neatly, as though for church. Martha pressed her wedding ring back onto her finger, whispering, "If we're visiting a house, I want to look like I belong in one again." The next evening, A silver sedan pulled up in front of the apartment building just as the sun began to set. The driver, a young woman in a navy blazer with the Light Foundation emblem pinned to her lapel, stepped out and greeted them with a kind smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Lane? My name is Angela. It's so nice to finally meet you." Martha leaned gently on George's arm as they walked toward the car. She moved slowly, still weak, but there was a faint spark in her eyes that hadn't been there in weeks. George opened the door for her and helped her into the back seat before settling beside her. As the car began to move, he noticed they weren't heading toward the downtown area, but rather toward the old neighborhoods near Pasadena's edge. The ride was quiet. Martha stared out the window, her hand resting lightly in George's. Streetlights flickered on one by one as they passed familiar roads, intersections they'd crossed hundreds of times before. George's brow furrowed as the scenery became more recognizable. The grocery store where they'd shopped for decades, the bakery where Martha once sold her pies, and finally, the old church on the corner where they'd been married. Then, as the car turned down a narrow lane lined with oak trees, George froze. "Angela," he said, his voice catching, "where are we going?" Angela looked back from the passenger seat and smiled gently. "We're almost there." The sedan slowed as it approached a small white house at the end of the street. The golden light of sunset bathed the porch, making it glow softly like something out of a dream. The freshly painted shutters, the flower beds filled with bright marigolds, the familiar shape of the oak tree. It was unmistakable. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "George," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't be." He stared through the window, his breath shallow. "That's our house," he said hoarsely. "That's our home." Angela turned off the engine and opened her door. "It's yours again," she said gently. "A donor who believes that good people should never lose their home wanted you to have it back. Everything inside has been restored with care. Please, go see it." Martha stepped out, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. George followed, barely able to speak. Together they walked up the same steps they'd thought they'd never climb again. The porch light flickered on, warm and welcoming. Martha turned to Angela, her voice breaking. "But who did this?" Angela smiled softly. "Someone who remembers what kindness looks like." George looked around, overcome, whispering, "I don't know how to thank whoever they are." Angela nodded toward the door. "Then just go home, Mr. Lane. That will be thanks enough." As the couple stepped inside, the evening sun spilled through the windows, painting the rooms in gold. Everything was just as it had been, yet somehow even more beautiful. The house, once lost, had come back to life. And for the first time in a long time, so had they. The moment Martha stepped through the doorway, her knees gave way. George caught her gently, steadying her as her trembling hand reached for the nearest wall. The faint smell of lemon polish and fresh paint filled the air. But beneath it lingered something far older, the scent of home. It was as if the years had folded in on themselves, and time had brought them right back to where they belonged. Everything was there. The lace curtains fluttered softly by the kitchen window. The old hummingbird feeder hung by the porch, freshly cleaned and glistening in the evening light. The floorboards creaked in the same places, familiar and comforting. Even the little scratch on the hallway doorframe where George had once bumped a chair remained untouched. Martha's eyes filled with tears. She stepped into the living room and gasped when she saw the upright piano in the corner, polished and waiting. She ran her hand across the smooth wood, tracing the spot where she used to place her sheet music. "It's the same," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Every bit of it. The same." George looked around, speechless. The sunlight streamed through the front window, casting golden rays across the photos already hung on the walls. Their wedding portrait, the children's school pictures, even the small black and white photo of George in uniform. He blinked hard, unable to comprehend how all of it had returned. Angela stood quietly in the doorway, holding a small wooden plaque. "The donor wanted this to be part of your home," she said softly, handing it to George. He read the inscription aloud, his voice trembling. "In honor of lives lived with light." He stared at the words for a long moment, then looked up at Martha. "That's you, sweetheart," he said, his tone breaking into a tearful smile. "That's always been you." Martha's lips quivered as she nodded. "No," she said quietly, clutching his arm. "It's us." She turned slowly in the prost, middle of the room, her eyes taking in every detail. The crocheted table runner she'd made 40 years ago, perfectly laid out again. The bookshelf George had built by hand, now restored and standing tall. She touched everything as if afraid it would vanish if she didn't. When her gaze landed on the kitchen, she froze. The window box outside was filled with marigolds, her favorite. Their bright gold petals swayed gently in the evening breeze, just as they had every summer. Her voice was barely a whisper. "George." Someone remembered. He nodded, swallowing hard. Someone cared enough to. Martha walked toward the piano and sat down carefully on the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant, then pressed one. The note rang clear, trembling like a heartbeat. Then another. Within moments, the room filled with the soft, familiar tune she had once played for their children at bedtime, a lullaby she hadn't touched in years. George turned toward her, his face wet with tears. The music was fragile, imperfect, but it filled the house like sunlight returning to a forgotten room. As the last notes of the lullaby faded, the house seemed to exhale, as though recognizing the sound of its own heart again. Martha let her hands rest on the keys and turned toward George, her face streaked with tears but lit by something deeper. "Peace. Do you hear that?" she whispered. "It's like it's alive again." George nodded, unable to speak. He reached out and took her hand, the two of them sitting in silence, listening to the echoes of the life they thought they'd lost. The air felt warm, gentle, alive. They moved through the room slowly, as though walking through a dream. In the hallway, the pencil marks on the doorframe had been cleaned, but not erased. The names Michael, Sarah, and faintly below them, George plus Martha still remained. Someone had carefully sealed the wood so those marks would never fade again. Martha pressed her hand against them, whispering, "They even kept our years." In the kitchen, the cupboards opened smoothly. Dishes were stacked neatly inside, the same blue and white set she'd once owned. The faint scent of cinnamon lingered. Someone had thought to bake something before their arrival. She looked out the window toward the garden and gasped softly. The bird bath had been repaired. The marigolds were freshly planted. Even the small stepping stones she'd set down decades ago had been scrubbed clean. George leaned against the counter, shaking his head in disbelief. "Whoever did this, they didn't just rebuild the house," he said quietly. "They rebuilt our life." Martha smiled faintly. "No one could have done all this without knowing us, without remembering." Angela stood near the door, her voice gentle. "The person who made this possible didn't want to be named. They just said that some homes carry more than memories, they carry the light people leave behind." Tears welled again in Martha's eyes. "Please, tell them thank you. Tell them they gave us back what we thought the world forgot." Angela nodded, moved by the quiet gratitude in the woman's voice. "I will," she promised. As evening settled, the house filled with the amber glow of sunset. The light poured through the lace curtains, spilling across the walls like golden water. Martha and George stood at the window, holding each other as the marigolds swayed in the wind. Across the street, a lone figure stood by a tree, watching. He wore a cap pulled low, his posture calm, unassuming. Keanu stood there in the fading light, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. From where he stood, he could see them smiling through the glass, two silhouettes framed by the glow of their restored home. He felt something shift inside him, the quiet satisfaction that comes not from being seen, but from knowing something right had been restored. He smiled faintly, then turned away, walking slowly down the street as the sun dipped below the rooftops. Behind him, the porch light flickered on, steady and bright. It was no longer just a house. It was alive again, carrying laughter, warmth, and the kind of light that never needed a name to shine. 2 days after the Lanes returned home, a short feel-good blurb ran in the Pasadena Chronicle. Local foundation restores home to elderly couple. It was meant to be a pleasant closer for the Sunday edition, the type of story people clipped and stuck to refrigerators. But one reader didn't move on. His name was Adam Keller, a freelance reporter with a habit of tugging loose threads. The article mentioned a group he'd never heard of, the Light Foundation, and a donor who insisted on anonymity. That was the first thread. Adam started with public filings. He combed California's charities registry, then leaned on a friend in nonprofit accounting to trace grant disbursements. The Light Foundation had appeared suddenly, moved efficiently, and funded a single, unusually expensive project in Pasadena. No gala, no board photos, no press kits, just a clean logo, a single golden flame, and a mission sentence about preserving homes where kindness once lived. He cross-referenced the foundation's banked escrow transfers with known philanthropic entities. A pattern emerged. Several routing intermediaries overlapped with organizations Adam had mapped years ago while covering celebrity giving. Some of those intermediaries had quietly processed gifts from Keanu Reeves' long-standing charities, children's hospitals, cancer research funds, and emergency relief grants. The names were different. The timing felt the same. Transfers landed just before weekends. Paperwork was pristine. Nobody took a bow. Adam built a spreadsheet. The more he color-coded, the more familiar it looked. He expanded his search to vendor payments tied to the Pasadena address. The restoration had been done by local craftsmen who rarely worked on spec. Their invoices, filed under a contractor cooperative, referenced a purchaser, the Light Foundation. He pulled those names and rang them all. Most declined to elaborate, but one elderly mason, proud of good work done right, let something slip. The client said, "Don't erase the story, restore it." The line rang in Adam's head. He remembered an old magazine interview from years back, a quiet quote that had stuck with him because it wasn't the sort of thing celebrities said for applause. He found it in his notes. Keanu Reeves, asked why he kept certain donations anonymous, had replied, "Home is where kindness lives. You don't sign your name on a sunrise." The words matched the restoration's ethos so closely that Adam felt his pulse quicken. He called a publicist he trusted, off the record, someone who'd handled red carpets and quiet favors for decades. If someone built a shell foundation to return a foreclosed home to an elderly veteran and his wife, Adam asked, who would it sound like? The publicist paused, then said a single name. He didn't record it. He didn't need to. By midnight, Adam had drafted the piece. He was careful with the language. Suggests, appears, consistent with, anonymous sources who requested confidentiality. He laid out the timeline, the financial conduits, the shared intermediaries, and the philosophy that tied it all together. A pattern of generosity that avoided cameras and slogans, preferring doors quietly reopened and lives quietly mended. He ended with the quote that had started this chase, "Home is where kindness lives." He reread the story 3 times, cut every flourish, and let the facts breathe. Then he hit publish on his independent newsletter, syndicating a shorter version to the Chronicle's digital desk with the headline, "Is Keanu Reeves the light behind the Light Foundation?" A quiet pattern of giving points to yes. The first pings were small, a few retweets, a handful of emails, a text from his editor that just read, bold. Adam closed his laptop and stared at the ceiling, unsure whether he'd traced a miracle or a rumor. He only knew the shape of it felt true. By dawn, his phone would decide for him. By morning, the story had spread across every platform. Headlines filled the internet. Keanu Reeves secretly buys back Veterans Home. Anonymous foundation linked to Keanu Reeves. And Hollywood's quietest star does it again. The comments sections overflowed with praise and disbelief. Within hours, reporters descended on Willow Street. Camera vans parked by the sidewalk. Drones buzzed overhead, and curious neighbors peered from behind their fences. George opened the front door to find 3 journalists waiting politely at the porch. "Mr. Lane, we're from the Chronicle," one said carefully. "Do you know that the donor who helped you might be Keanu Reeves?" George blinked, confused. "Keanu Reeves?" he repeated, almost laughing. "The actor?" They nodded. Multiple sources confirm the funds for your restoration came from accounts tied to his charities. Can you confirm he ever contacted you?" He shook his head, still trying to process the question. "No, never. We never spoke to anyone by that name. We just received help. That's all." Inside, Martha sat on the couch, the newspaper spread open across her lap. There was a photo of her and George standing on their porch under the headline, "The Light Foundation's First Miracle." And beneath that, a smaller caption quoting Keanu from years ago, "Home is where kindness lives." Her lips trembled as she read the line again and again. Slowly, she set the paper down and looked toward the window. "It was him all along," she whispered. George turned, his eyes softening as the truth sank in. "You mean that boy on the bike," he said quietly. "The one who used to stop for lemonade." Martha nodded, tears welling. "Yes, he came back." Outside, the crowd grew thicker, cameras flashing as curious strangers gathered around the little white house that had once stood forgotten. Reporters called out for statements, asking what it felt like to have been chosen by one of the world's most beloved stars. But George and Martha stayed inside, holding hands in the living room that had just been restored. George smiled faintly. "He didn't do it for attention," he said. "He did it because he remembered." Martha leaned her head against his shoulder. "And because kindness," she whispered, glancing at the inscription on their wall plaque, "always finds its way home." Outside, the evening sun washed the house in gold once more, a quiet reminder that some stories shine brightest when they are meant to be shared. The sun hung low over Pasadena a few days later, the afternoon light soft and golden. On Willow Street, peace had finally returned. The reporters were gone, the camera crews had moved on to other stories, and the quiet hum of ordinary life filled the neighborhood again. Birds chirped from the oak tree, a gentle breeze carried the scent of marigolds, and the newly restored house stood proudly in the glow of late summer. George was outside by the fence, tightening a loose hinge with an old wrench. The rhythm of the work soothed him, the click of metal against wood, the slow exhale after each turn. Just a few steps away, Martha knelt in the garden, her wide-brimmed hat shading her face as she pressed fresh soil around the base of her flowers. Her hands were still fragile, but there was color in her cheeks again. She hummed quietly, the same tune she used to play on her piano, her voice barely above the whisper of wind. George looked over at her, smiling softly. "You're starting to sound like yourself again," he said. Martha glanced up, her eyes twinkling. "Maybe that's because I finally feel like myself again," she replied. "It's strange, I thought coming back would make me sad, but it's like the house remembered us. Every creak, every sound, it's all saying, 'Welcome home.'" George leaned on the fence, nodding. "Maybe kindness really does leave something behind." She smiled, turning back to her marigolds. "Maybe it leaves a light." From down the street, the low hum of an engine approached. George looked up to see a black motorcycle coming into view, gliding quietly toward the curb. The rider slowed, turned off the engine, and removed his helmet. For a moment, neither of them recognized him. The sunlight caught his face, and realization dawned slowly, the same calm expression. The gentle eyes they'd seen in newspapers, interviews, and screens across the world. Martha froze. "George," she whispered, "that's him. Keanu." Reeves walked toward them, dressed simply in jeans and a faded shirt, his steps unhurried. He smiled faintly, almost shyly. "Hello," he said softly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." George stood stunned, the wrench slipping from his hand. Martha rose slowly from the garden, brushing the dirt from her gloves. Her lips trembled. You're the man from the article," she said. Keanu nodded gently. "I suppose I am." She took a step closer, squinting as though looking through years of memory. "And you're also the boy on the bike." For a moment, everything stopped. Then Keanu smiled, his voice warm. "And you were the lady who gave me lemonade." Martha covered her mouth, her body shaking with emotion. "I can't believe it's you," she whispered. "After all these years." He smiled softly, his eyes kind. "I never forgot this street," he said. "Or you." Martha dropped her gloves and ran the few steps toward him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. Tears spilled freely down her face. "No one has saved us with such kindness since the end of the war," she said between sobs. Keanu held her gently, shaking his head. "You saved me first," he whispered. "I just returned the favor." George stood beside them, his eyes glistening as he extended his hand. Keanu took it firmly, and for a long moment, the three of them simply stood there in the sunlight, the past, present, and gratitude quietly intertwined. They sat together on the porch afterward, the same porch Keanu had touched weeks earlier when it was still worn and broken. Now it gleamed in the sun, freshly painted, the boards creaking softly beneath their feet. Martha brought out a tray with 3 glasses of lemonade, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. "It felt wrong not to offer you one," she said with a laugh that wavered between joy and disbelief. Keanu smiled and took a glass. "You remembered." "How could I forget?" she said, her voice thick with feeling. "That day you came riding past. You looked so lost. You couldn't have been older than 10. I thought you were just another boy passing through." "I was," Keanu replied quietly. "My mother had just moved us to a new apartment a few blocks away. Everything felt strange. That lemonade, it was the first kind thing anyone had done for me in a long time." Martha blinked rapidly, trying to keep her tears from falling again. "You grew up to be someone who gives kindness back to the world. You didn't have to do this, Keanu. We would have understood if no one remembered us." He shook his head gently. "You don't forget the people who show you goodness when you have nothing. You built this home with love. It deserved to stay alive." George leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "I fought in Korea," he said softly. "We came home, bought this house, and thought we'd never lose it. I thought I'd seen all the miracles I was ever going to see. Then you showed up." Keanu smiled faintly. "You already had your miracle. You just needed it to find its way back to you." For a while, they sat in easy silence, sipping lemonade while the breeze rustled the marigolds nearby. The air carried the scent of fresh earth and old memories. Martha turned to him and said, "You know, when I was in the hospital, I prayed that someone out there would remember us not for pity, but because we tried to be good." "You were good," Keanu said, meeting her eyes. "And the world needs to remember people like you." She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You gave us back more than a house. You gave us back our life." He smiled gently, his voice soft but steady. "Then maybe we're even now." George chuckled quietly. "I don't think anyone's ever been even with you, son." The laughter that followed was light and warm. The sun dipped lower, painting the porch in amber and gold. Keanu stood at last, glancing toward the street. "I should get going," he said. Martha rose with him, her smile trembling. "You'll always have a home here," she whispered. He nodded. "I already did." As he walked back toward his motorcycle, the couple watched him go the boy on the bike, grown into the man who'd given their story back its light. Within a week, the story had traveled far beyond Pasadena. Local newspapers called it the Light Miracle, while national outlets picked up the thread of quiet generosity. But the most remarkable change didn't happen online. It happened right there on Willow Street. Neighbors who had once closed their blinds during the lane's eviction now stepped forward. The silence that had once filled the street was replaced by the sound of hammers, laughter, and community. The house at the end of the lane became a symbol not just of a restored home, but of what kindness could awaken. Mrs. Diaz, the woman who had once handed Martha a bag of sandwiches the day she moved out, arrived one morning with a rake in her hand. "I can't just sit and watch anymore," she said with a smile. "That man showed us what we should have done long ago." She began tidying the sidewalk, humming as she worked. Soon after, other neighbors joined. The Johnson kids repainted an elderly widow's fence 2 houses down. A retired mechanic fixed the rusted mailbox that had leaned sideways for years. Even the local shop owner donated supplies, saying quietly, It's about time we looked out for each other again. Within days, the small act of restoration had rippled outward like sunlight spreading over rooftops. Across town, a group of high school students decided to act too. Inspired by the viral article, they organized a volunteer event they called Light Day. Flyers appeared in every coffee shop and classroom. One Saturday, one city. Countless homes made brighter. The goal was simple: repaint, repair, restore the homes of elderly residents who couldn't afford the upkeep. When the first Light Day arrived, dozens of teens showed up wearing bright yellow shirts with a single golden flame printed over the heart. Teachers, parents, and veterans joined them, forming a sea of energy and goodwill across Pasadena. They scrubbed walls, planted gardens, fixed fences, and brought laughter back to quiet streets. Keanu never appeared publicly that day, but a small, unmarked delivery truck stopped by the community center early in the morning. Inside were paint cans, brushes, lumber, gloves, and bottled water, all labeled simply, "Donated by the Light Foundation." At noon, the mayor stopped by to shake hands with volunteers. "This movement isn't about one man," she said in her speech. "It's about what he reminded us of, that light doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone willing to carry it forward." Back on Willow Street, Martha sat on the porch with George, watching the bustle unfold down the block. Groups of neighbors were repainting a house whose owner, Mrs. Reynolds, hadn't stepped outside in years. Children ran by carrying tools far too big for their hands, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Martha leaned back in her chair, her voice soft but steady. "He lit something far bigger than our house, George." George nodded slowly, his gaze following the sunlight stretching across the rooftops. "He reminded us all what it means to belong." She smiled, her hands folded in her lap. "For the first time in a long time, this street feels alive again." That evening, as dusk settled over Pasadena, the glow of porch lights flickered to life, one by one, not just on Willow Street, but all across the neighborhood. Some were new bulbs, others old ones cleaned and replaced, but each carried the same quiet symbol. A light turned on, not out of habit, but out of hope. From his hotel window overlooking the city, Keanu watched the soft pattern of lights bloom across the horizon. His phone buzzed a message from Lila, his assistant. Light Day was a success. Hundreds volunteered. "They're already planning next month." He smiled faintly and replied, "Good, let it grow." Quietly, he set the phone down and looked out again at the rows of glowing houses below. Each one represented a family, a story, a memory, being cared for again. And though no one knew it, he whispered something to the glass. A simple line he'd carried for years. "Kindness doesn't fade, it multiplies." Down on Willow Street, Martha and George sat in the same chairs until night fully covered the sky. The hum of voices faded, leaving only the gentle sound of crickets and the flicker of porch lights reflecting off the marigolds. Martha sighed softly, closing her eyes. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" George smiled faintly. "I think he already has. Every time someone helps another person here, that's him too." She nodded, her heart calm and full. The little golden flame on their wall plaque shimmered in the lamplight, as though it too had come alive. And for the first time in years, Willow Street didn't feel forgotten anymore. It felt lit by compassion, by memory, and by the quiet proof that one act of kindness could turn into 1,000 more. The following weekend, Pasadena held its first official Light Festival, a simple gathering that began with candles and ended with laughter. People shared stories about small kindnesses: a free meal, a repaired porch, a neighbor's visit after years of silence. No one spoke of fame or fortune. They spoke of decency. At the center of the park, a young student read aloud from the article that had started everything. Her voice trembled slightly as she said, "Kindness doesn't fade, it multiplies." The crowd repeated the words softly, as if reciting a promise to one another. Martha and George sat in the front row, holding hands. Around them were faces they once barely knew: neighbors, volunteers, teachers, students, all of them smiling, all of them changed. Martha turned to George, her eyes glistening. "It's like he left a trail of light behind him," she whispered. George smiled. And everyone found their way back home. Later that night, as lanterns floated into the dark sky, the golden flame emblem of the Light Foundation was projected onto the city hall. No speeches, no celebrity appearances, just a quiet image that said everything. From a distance, Keanu watched in silence, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. The lanterns drifted upward like stars being born, their glow mirrored in his eyes. He smiled faintly, turned to leave, and whispered to himself, "They didn't just get their house back. The world got its heart back." Within days, the miracle on Willow Street became a global headline. What had begun as a quiet neighborhood story turned into a movement of hope sweeping across television, social media, and newspapers worldwide. Morning shows replayed clips of the little white house bathed in sunlight, calling it a symbol of faith and forgotten kindness. Talk show hosts debated whether it was real humility or modern myth, and countless viewers wept as they watched footage of Martha and George standing on their restored porch, holding hands beneath the marigolds. One network anchor began his segment with the words, "In a time when fame often overshadows virtue, one man's silence has spoken louder than any award speech." The image of Keanu Reeves, humble and unassuming, filled the screen. The hosts recounted his long history of quiet philanthropy, from helping crew members pay for college to donating secretly to children's hospitals. But this time, the story was different. This time, his kindness had a face, a home, and a heartbeat. Requests for interviews flooded in from every direction. Late-night shows, magazines, even international outlets eager to hear the man behind the miracle. But Keanu declined them all. His publicist released a single written statement, short and clear. Kindness should never need a signature. Those 7 words spread faster than the story itself. They appeared on posters, t-shirts, school walls, and digital billboards. Teachers used them in classrooms. Ministers quoted them in Sunday sermons. Social media turned them into a mantra, shared millions of times by people longing to believe in something good again. Back in Pasadena, reporters still lingered near Willow Street. Though they kept a respectful distance, neighbors spoke of how Keanu's act had changed not just one couple's life, but the spirit of the entire town. "He reminded us what community used to mean," said Mrs. Diaz, the woman who'd first brought Martha sandwiches. "We stopped being neighbors who nodded from across driveways. Now we're family again." At the Light Foundation's small downtown office, phones rang non-stop. Donations began to pour in from all over the world. Small amounts, large checks, handwritten letters stuffed with cash. One envelope contained only a note that read, "For someone else's porch light." By the end of the week, contributions had tripled, enough to fund dozens of future restorations. But Keanu asked for no credit. He refused to let his name appear on the foundation's documents or in any promotional materials. The director, Lila, told reporters simply, "He wants the light to speak for itself." And it did. By the second week, the ripple had turned into a wave. News anchors around the world referred to it as the Light Effect. Hashtags flooded every platform. Number The Light Foundation. Number Kindness Without Credit. Number Be the Light. People began sharing their own acts of compassion, often ending their posts with the words Keanu had written, "Kindness should never need a signature." In Canada, a retired teacher paid the overdue rent for a struggling single mother, writing only, "Pass it on." In Ohio, a group of veterans restored the front porch of a fellow soldier's widow. Across the ocean in Japan, volunteers began repainting homes in quiet neighborhoods, calling their project Hikari, the Japanese word for light. The movement had outgrown one man. It had become a language everyone understood. At the Light Foundation's office, the front desk overflowed with envelopes and boxes. Thousands of letters arrived each day, some written on fancy stationery, others scribbled on notebook paper. Each one carried a story, a thank you, a confession, a rediscovery of hope. One letter came from a teenage boy who wrote, "I grew up thinking kindness was weakness. Now I see its strength. Thank you for showing me what being strong really means." Another arrived from a widow in Chicago. My husband died before he could finish fixing our roof. Volunteers came this week through your program. I didn't just get a roof. I got my faith back." The staff tried to read every one, but they soon had to set up a separate room just to store them. They called it the light room. The air there smelled faintly of paper and ink, but what lingered most was the warmth of thousands of hearts reignited by one quiet act. Meanwhile, Keanu kept his distance. He was filming on location in Vancouver when the Foundation's director, Lila, called to give him an update. "We've received more support than we can handle," she said, her voice filled with awe. "It's turning into something big. Schools, churches, whole neighborhoods joining in. Everyone wants to be part of it." Keanu listened, leaning against the window of his hotel room as evening light spilled across the floor. "That's good," he said softly. "Just make sure it stays about the people, not me." "It already is," she said. "But they keep asking for a statement, something more." He smiled faintly. "Tell them the same thing I told the first time. The light doesn't need a name." For a long time after the call, he stayed by the window, watching the sun dip below the skyline. His reflection stared back older, quieter, a man who'd seen enough loss to know how rare it was to witness hope rising again. Somewhere below, he imagined porch lights flickering on one by one, the same way they had on Willow Street. He thought of Martha tending her flowers, George fixing his fence, the way the house had glowed that night in silence. It had been more than a gift. It had been a circle completed. The next morning, a journalist from the Los Angeles Times wrote, "In an age of noise, Keanu Reeves has reminded the world of the power of quiet." And though Keanu never responded publicly, he did read one of the letters that had arrived that week, one written in Martha's delicate handwriting. It was short, just a few sentences. "You gave us back our home, but what you really gave us was proof that goodness never leaves it, just waits to be remembered." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket before heading out. No cameras followed, no press release was written. He simply walked into the morning light, content to let the world keep glowing on its own. The seasons turned gently over Pasadena, and Willow Street bloomed again. The marigolds outside the Lane home stood tall and golden, swaying in the mild spring air. Martha spent her final months surrounded by the peace she had longed for, the scent of flowers, the hum of distant laughter, the soft creak of her old piano bench when she sat to play. The neighborhood often stopped by with pies, flowers, and stories. Children from the local school painted birdhouses for her porch. She always smiled and said the same thing. Every light matters, no matter how small. George stayed by her side through every sunrise and every quiet evening. They grew slower together, softer together, their words fewer but filled with meaning. Sometimes they would just sit on the porch holding hands, saying nothing at all. The silence between them had turned from grief to grace. One night, Martha went to bed early. The house was quiet except for the faint rustle of wind through the lace curtains. George checked on her, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Good night, sweetheart." She smiled faintly in her sleep. That was the last time he saw her alive. In the morning, the light streamed softly through the window, touching her face like a blessing. George knew the moment he entered the room. There was no fear, no struggle, only calm. Her hands rested over her heart, and beside her on the nightstand lay an envelope, the edges slightly worn, addressed in her delicate handwriting. "To the light." George sat down slowly, his trembling fingers brushing the paper. For a long while, he couldn't open it. He simply stared at her neat cursive, knowing she had written it with love meant to outlast her. Finally, he broke the seal. The note inside was short, written on the same kind of stationery she used for birthdays and thank you cards. The words were gentle, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. "To the light," it began. "Thank you for giving us back our home and our dignity. You didn't just save us from losing a house, you saved us from losing ourselves. You turned loss into grace, despair into peace, and strangers into family. Wherever you are, keep lighting the way. There will always be someone standing in the dark, waiting for kindness to find them. With love, Martha Lane." George pressed the letter to his chest, the tears coming silently. Then he placed it back on the nightstand, beside her wedding ring, and whispered, "You found the words I never could." He called the Light Foundation later that week, asking if he could send them something special, a letter from his late wife. "It belongs with them," he said. "She wrote it for whoever brought us home." When the foundation received the envelope, Lila recognized the handwriting immediately. She read the note with tears in her eyes, then made a copy and sent it to one more person, the man who had made it all possible. The letter arrived at Keanu's Los Angeles home on a quiet afternoon. It came in a simple white envelope, tucked inside a stack of ordinary mail. There was no return address, only the faint embossed seal of the Light Foundation. He recognized it immediately. Setting aside the rest of the mail, he carried the envelope to the kitchen and sat down at the wooden table by the window. Outside, the city buzzed faintly in the distance, but inside, everything felt still. He turned the envelope over in his hands for a moment, tracing the edge before opening it carefully. Inside was a single folded page and a short note from, "This letter was written by Mrs. Lane before she passed. She wanted it sent to the Light. We thought you should have it." He unfolded the paper slowly. The handwriting was elegant, graceful, the same handwriting from the thank you letter she had sent months ago. He began to read, and the words felt like a soft whisper from another time. "To the Light. Thank you for giving us back our home and our dignity. You turned loss into grace. Wherever you are, keep lighting the way." Keanu read the letter twice, then a third time, his eyes blurring with tears. He placed it flat on the table and leaned back, staring out the window at the afternoon sun spilling across the hills. For a long time, he didn't move. The letter felt like a benediction, a closing of a circle that had started decades ago with a boy on a bicycle and a woman offering lemonade. He whispered her words under his breath. "You turned loss into grace." A faint smile crossed his face, though his eyes glistened. "No, Martha," he murmured, his voice breaking slightly. "You did that. You always did." He folded the letter carefully, smoothing its edges, then slipped it back into the envelope and placed it inside a small wooden box that sat on the counter. Inside the box were only a few items. An old photograph of his mother, a guitar pick, a folded note from a fan who once wrote that his kindness had saved her life. The letter now rested among them, perfectly at home. As the light shifted across the kitchen floor, Keanu stood and poured himself a cup of coffee, letting the quiet fill the room. He looked once more at the box and whispered, "Rest easy, Martha." Outside, the world carried on, traffic moving, children laughing, sunlight dancing across rooftops. But for Keanu, everything slowed. In that silence, he felt her presence not as sorrow, but as peace. The kind of peace that comes when something beautiful has completed its purpose. He walked to the back door and stepped outside. The evening light fell across his face, warm and golden. In the distance, the faint scent of marigolds drifted through the air, and for a moment, he imagined Willow Street again, the laughter, the porch light, and the quiet promise that kindness never truly ends. He looked toward the horizon and smiled. "Wherever you are," he whispered, "thank you for reminding me." A full year had passed since Martha's letter reached him, but her words never faded. Keanu carried them like a quiet compass, folded neatly in his jacket pocket whenever he traveled. The Light Foundation had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. What had started as one restored house in Pasadena was now a network of compassion stretching across the country, dozens of volunteers, new chapters in 5 states, and hundreds of lives quietly transformed. In Oregon, a small town near the Columbia River had just completed one of the foundation's newest projects, a modest blue house for a veteran named Daniel Holt, his wife Claire, and their 2 young children. The Holts had been living in an old trailer after a flood destroyed their home. Volunteers had worked for months to rebuild a new place on the same land, using donated materials and hundreds of hours of community labor. The official handover was scheduled for that weekend, but Keanu didn't want to attend the ceremony. Instead, he arrived a few days early, alone, on his motorcycle. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pine-lined road as he pulled over near the house. It stood at the edge of a meadow, surrounded by tall grass and wildflowers. The air smelled of rain and wood smoke. He took off his helmet and watched for a while from a distance. The Holts were outside, painting the mailbox with their children's names in bright blue letters. The little girl, maybe 6 years old, kept dipping her brush into too much paint, leaving smudges everywhere. Her brother, a few years older, laughed so hard he fell over in the grass. Daniel, tall and broad-shouldered, looked down at them with a grin that carried both pride and relief. Claire stood on the porch, her hands over her heart, tears of joy in her eyes as she watched her family. Keanu smiled quietly. He didn't need to talk to them, didn't need them to know who he was. Watching them was enough. He saw something familiar in their laughter, the same feeling he'd witnessed on Willow Street, when Martha and George stood beneath their porch light again for the first time. It wasn't just joy, it was healing. The family gathered for a photo, taken by one of the volunteers. Keanu turned away, giving them their moment. He looked down the road toward the horizon, where sunlight shimmered over the trees. He whispered to himself, "You were right, Martha. The light keeps moving." As he walked back to his bike, a small gust of wind carried the scent of freshly cut grass and wildflowers. It brushed past him gently, like a quiet reminder from somewhere unseen. He slipped on his helmet, started the engine, and glanced one last time at the house. The sound of children's laughter carried across the field, bright and pure against the wind. Then, with a faint smile, he whispered, "Thank you for showing us the way." Keanu rode for miles along the Oregon backroads, the hum of his motorcycle blending with the rhythm of the wind through the evergreens. The road curved gently along the river, sunlight flickering through the branches overhead. Every few miles he passed small towns where people waved from porches, unaware that the man beneath the helmet was the same one whose quiet kindness had touched their news feeds months ago. He didn't need them to know. The anonymity was part of the peace. He stopped once at a ridge overlooking the valley. Below him, scattered houses dotted the landscape, their rooftops glinting faintly in the golden light. He thought about each home. The Light Foundation had rebuilt veterans, single parents, elderly couples, families starting over after fires or floods. Every story different, but each one linked by the same invisible thread. The belief that a home wasn't just a shelter, it was the soul of belonging. He turned off the engine and sat there, letting the silence fill the space around him. His reflection appeared faintly in the side mirror, a man older, now quieter, but more at peace than he'd been in years. In his pocket, Martha's letter remained folded, the edges worn from being opened so many times. He took it out, unfolded it once more, and read the closing line aloud. "Wherever you are, keep lighting the way." The words carried softly into the breeze, fading into the sound of rustling pines. He smiled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I will." Back in town, the sun began to dip low, turning the fields amber. Children were still playing outside, their laughter rising like music through the air. Porch lights flicked on one by one, a chain of soft yellow glows stretching across the neighborhood. To anyone else, they were ordinary lights. But to him, they were proof. Proof that goodness multiplies, that compassion, once lit, never truly goes dark. He started his motorcycle again, the engine rumbling gently to life. The road ahead shimmered beneath the fading sun, endless and open. As he rode, the wind caught the edges of his jacket, carrying the faint scent of pine, earth, and rain, the scent of life continuing, of stories unfolding beyond his reach. Far behind him, the Holt's home stood like a beacon in the dusk, the laughter of children still echoing across the yard. Keanu didn't look back. He didn't need to. The legacy wasn't behind him, it was everywhere now. The camera would have followed him down that quiet Oregon highway, the sky painted in streaks of gold and violet. His silhouette against the horizon, solitary but never alone, a figure carrying light into the distance. And as the wind rushed past him, he whispered the same words he had spoken the day he bought that first house back in Pasadena. "No one loses their story," he said softly. "Not if someone chooses to remember." The motorcycle disappeared into the horizon, leaving only the glow of twilight and the unending echo of a kindness that would never fade. The wind carried the soft hum of Keanu's motorcycle long after the road turned quiet again. As the light of day faded, his voice began to echo gently in the minds of those who had followed the journey, calm, thoughtful, and filled with the quiet conviction that had guided everything from the beginning. Some homes, his voice said, are made of bricks and wood. Others are built from memories and kindness. The scene shifted to a montage, slow, peaceful images of homes across the country. A young couple holding their newborn in front of a rebuilt porch. An elderly veteran saluting from his driveway as volunteers planted flowers. Children running through sprinklers across neatly mended lawns. Each home glowed in the golden light of early evening, the air alive with laughter and gratitude. Keanu's voice continued, steady but tender. The greatest foundation we can ever build isn't made of concrete or stone. It's the one that holds people together. A foundation built on love, forgiveness, and compassion. As his words played, the screen faded between glimpses of the Light Foundation's growing movement. Volunteers in yellow shirts painting homes, high school students delivering groceries to seniors, neighbors helping each other rebuild storm-damaged roofs. The sound of hammers mixed with laughter, footsteps, and quiet acts of grace. The music underneath was soft, almost like a heartbeat. Sometimes, Keanu said, the smallest act of kindness can travel farther than we ever imagine. A word, a smile, a moment of help. You might think it ends there, but it doesn't. It keeps going, finding someone else in need, lighting another path. The video showed a woman opening a door to a freshly restored home. A boy handing her a flower. A veteran shaking hands with a young volunteer. Then a brief shot of the original house on Willow Street, now surrounded by marigolds swaying gently in the breeze. That house, Keanu said softly, was more than a home. It was a reminder, a promise that good still lives among us, quiet, humble, and patient, waiting for someone to notice. The music rose slightly as the camera drifted over Pasadena's skyline at dusk. Lights flickered on across neighborhoods, one after another, like small stars awakening on the ground. And maybe that's what this story was really about, Keanu's voice continued. Not fame, not credit, but belonging, the kind of belonging that comes from knowing we are not alone in this world, that there is always someone willing to lift another person back into the light. A new montage began clips of volunteers repairing homes in Oregon, Texas, and Ohio. A community hugging after a storm. Children hanging a handmade sign that read, "The light lives here." Keanu's voice softened again. I've met people who think kindness is disappearing. But maybe it's not gone. Maybe it's just waiting for us to remember it the way Martha did when she shared a glass of lemonade with a stranger so many years ago. The screen returned to the image of Martha and George's restored home at sunset, golden light pouring from its windows. The camera slowly zoomed out until the little white house was just one glowing dot among hundreds across the map. Kindness, Keanu said gently, doesn't fade. It multiplies. A pause, quiet and still, as the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon. Then his tone shifted slightly, turning reflective, personal, as though he were speaking directly to the listener. Maybe you've known someone who carried light into your life when you needed it most. Someone who showed up, said the right words, or gave you hope when everything else felt dark. If you have, tell their story, share it below. Because their light deserves to be remembered. The music deepened, carrying a note of warmth and hope. The montage now showed more houses, restored porches, families hugging, flags waving in the breeze, flowers blooming. Beside fences once broken. Across the screen appeared a soft white line of text, in memory of Martha and George Lane, whose kindness still lights the way. The camera faded to Keanu, standing by his motorcycle on a quiet country road. He looked out at the sky, painted in gold and violet, his expression calm and peaceful. His final words carried the tone of a lesson, simple but eternal. Maybe the world doesn't need more heroes, he said. Maybe it just needs more people who care. That's how we build something that lasts, not with our hands, but with our hearts. The sound of the motorcycle engine rumbled softly, blending with the music. As the camera slowly panned upward toward the setting sun, his voice faded one last time. "If you believe kindness still changes the world," he said, his tone warm and resolute, "hit like, share this incredible story, and subscribe for more stories that prove compassion never fades." The screen glowed gently, showing the emblem of the Light Foundation, a golden flame shining against a black background. Below it, the words appeared, "Because good people deserve good endings." The music softened into silence. Then the light flickered once, steady and eternal, before the screen faded to black. The credits rolled softly over the image of a sunrise, breaking over quiet neighborhoods. Gentle piano music played as names of volunteers, donors, and foundation members appeared on screen, each name representing another spark of light. Then, one last scene appeared. Keanu sat on the edge of a wooden porch, sunrise reflecting in his eyes. He held a small candle in his hand, its flame steady despite the breeze. He looked toward the camera with a calm smile and said, "We can't fix every problem, but we can always choose to care." He set the candle down on the step beside him. Its glow spread across the frame, warm and golden. The screen slowly faded to white, displaying the words, "The Light Foundation, inspired by true kindness." Then, Keanu's voice returned one final time, gentle and direct. "If this incredible story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in goodness. Let's remind the world that compassion never goes out of style." The candle's flame flickered one last time before the screen faded to black. Then, in simple text, the closing line appeared. "Keep the light alive. Be someone's reason to hope."